Okay, what if I told you that the truest measure of intelligence isn't really your IQ, but your humility? It's a pretty wild idea, right? Well, today we're diving into a fascinating treatise that makes this exact argument. And it does it using this really powerful metaphor that's going to make us rethink how we see our own minds, our pride, and just our ability to see the world clearly.
And here it is. This is the core idea of the entire piece. The author isn't just throwing out a nice quote here. Nope. This is a framework for two totally different ways of using our minds. One way, you're just looking at yourself. The other way, well, it opens up a window to something way, way bigger. So let's really break this down. On one side, you've got the mirror of pride. The treatise says this is what happens when your intellect is all wrapped up in your ego. You end up just seeing a reflection of yourself. And that, it argues, leads to a kind of spiritual blindness. But then, on the other side, you have the window of truth. This is where intellect teams up with humility, and suddenly everything opens up. You get real understanding, you let the light shine through.
All right, so first up, let's take a closer look into that mirror. What does it actually look like when our intelligence gets, well, kind of trapped, just staring at itself?
So, according to the source, there are basically two types of people who fall into this trap. First, you have the intellectual and prideful. These are folks with some serious brain power, for sure, but they use it to build up these huge walls against any spiritual truths they don't want to hear. And then, and this one might sound a little familiar, you've got the arrogant uninformed. These are people who maybe lack the formal training, but they're super persuasive and can put out these critiques that, while misleading, get a ton of traction, especially on social media.
Which really makes you wonder, doesn't it? If this arrogant, uninformed group doesn't have the deep knowledge, where in the world does all that confidence come from? Well, the source actually has an answer for that.
And that answer, according to this treatise, comes down to a really well-known cognitive bias, the Dunning-Kruger effect. You've probably heard of it. It's this idea where people with low ability in something tend to way overestimate how good they are. Why? Well, because they lack the self-awareness to even see their own mistakes. They literally don't know what they don't know. And that can lead to this massive but totally misplaced confidence.
And to really hammer this point home, the author brings in a quote from C.S. Lewis. And man, this just captures the whole problem perfectly, right? A proud man is always looking down. And of course, as long as you're looking down, you just can't see something that's above you. It's a powerful way to put it.
Okay, so we've looked deep into the mirror of pride. Now, the source says it's time for the solution. We're going to shift our view from that mirror to the window and explore what this treatise calls true intelligence, something that can only be unlocked through humility.
And this is probably the most radical idea in the whole piece. The author proposes that humility is the true measure of intelligence. Think about that. It's not about your IQ score, it's not about how many degrees you have on your wall. The real measure, it argues, is humility. And we're not just talking about being modest. This is about a deep, fundamental openness to truth.
So, the natural question is, how do you even get this kind of intelligence? Well, the source lays out a pretty clear path. It's about four key things. First, you have to become teachable. Then, you have to be open to correction. That's a tough one for a lot of us. Third, it's about being able to communicate deep, profound truths in a simple way. And finally, and maybe most importantly, it's about always recognizing just how little you actually know. And what's the payoff for all this humility? According to the source, it's huge. And it's not just about being book smart. Look at this. Humility unlocks some really profound things: divine revelation, true understanding, spiritual wisdom, and clarity. And notice how the biggest chunks here, the vast majority of the benefits, are these deep spiritual gifts.
Now, the author isn't just pulling this idea out of thin air. They ground this whole argument in Scripture. The text points to this recurring theme, this kind of divine paradox, where God reveals truth not to the wise and prudent, the experts of the world, but to the babes and the humble. It's a total reversal of what we'd normally expect.
All right, so in this last section, things get super practical. The treatise takes this whole mirror and window idea and applies it to a real-world challenge. How do you actually engage with criticism? It offers a framework for understanding and responding to all sorts of different viewpoints.
And here's the framework it lays out. Now, we've already talked about the arrogant, uninformed, and the intellectual and prideful, but look at this. It adds a really interesting and nuanced distinction when it comes to former believers. It separates those who become hostile former members from what it calls quiet/sad leavers, people who leave but still hold a sense of respect for what they once believed.
Now, to explain the increased hostility it sees in some of those former members, the treatise actually turns to a theological idea from the Gospel of Matthew, the seven devils principle. The source's interpretation of this is that when someone rejects a spiritual truth, that empty space can sometimes get filled by something even more, well, hardened and antagonistic.
So, what's the playbook here? How should you respond? According to the source, the goal is absolutely not to win an argument. Forget that. Instead, the key is to lean on spiritual discernment and compassion. The advice is to reach out with love, not debate points, and to have the wisdom to recognize that some people, well, they might just be unreachable through argument.
And that brings us to the final, really powerful thought from the source. It takes humility and elevates it from just being a nice virtue to something incredibly profound. Humility, it says, isn't just a virtue, it's the very beginning of eternal intelligence. What a provocative idea to end on, right? It really challenges us to ask ourselves, are we spending too much time looking in the mirror, or are we willing to gaze through that clear, humble window to see what's really out there?